Hi, welcome back to Videos from the Ville. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, and this is Canadian Government and Politics. This particular lecture will be on Quebec separatism. We find that traditionally in Canadian history, one of the perennial questions has been, will Canada be here at the end of the next decade, or will it have disintegrated? We find that over the years, when Canada's population has been polled on this question, generally half of the population think that Canada will split into two. This has been for Canada over the years, and less so in recent years, but this has been a gaping wound in Canada's side, and it simply reveals the dissatisfaction that we found over the years in the province of Quebec. Quebec's French-speaking population and their French-speaking majority has for over 200 years agitated for English Canada to recognize Quebec and to recognize its true status. Many Quebecois consider their province a country, and they believe that their province is a separate nation within Canada, and they want it to be recognized as such. We find that until the 1980s, most English and French Canadians were hiding their differences, and they were hiding their differences in the interests of serving each other's needs. Canada needed to retain a vibrant culture, and the English speakers thought that the French speaking Quebec certainly did that. Quebec needed to stay allied to a strong national economy, but on the other hand, Quebec's people were always certain of their cultural superiority to the rest of Canada. Well, the concerns of the people of Quebec, the Quebecois, the concerns of the Quebecois begin to play a much greater role in Canadian politics in 1960. 1960 is the beginning of what we refer to as the Quiet Revolution. And this is the revolution that transforms Quebec from an old-fashioned conservative society into a modern progressive province. The Quebecois consider their province to be at the heart of French Canada. The other provinces are all dominated by an English-speaking majority. You find French speakers in New Brunswick. You find them in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. You find them in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But you find the greatest number, of course, of French speakers are focused and found firmly in the province of Quebec. You find that federal policies in Ottawa, however, have been controlled by English Canadians throughout Canadian history. But by 1960, the birth rate in Quebec was declining, and immigrants to Quebec wished to learn English. Many businesses in Quebec were controlled by English Canadians who only spoke English, even though their employees were French and spoke French. Hence, the Quebecois began to feel that their language and their culture was threatened. And this led eventually every government of Quebec, every government of, and they call themselves, by the way, when you go to Quebec City and you go to the provincial parliament, they call it the National Assembly, again stressing their role as a nation and wanting to be treated as such. But every Quebec government from 1960 with Jean Lesage, from Jean Lesage to Robert Bourassa in the 1990s, every Quebec government that we saw during this period of time began to become more strident and more assertive in their relations vis-a-vis Ottawa. You find that all these new governments in Quebec began to take control of every power that could be utilized by a province. They tried to take advantage of. Of course, what really sparked the Quiet Revolution was the visit of the French leader, the famous World War II leader and French Prime Minister Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle, on July 24th, 1967, visited Canada, and he spoke to French Canadians from the balcony of the City Hall in Montreal. And he caused quite a stir when he ended his speech with a long live independent French Canada, long live Quebec. You see on your PowerPoints that you should have by your side on paper or on your laptop by your side, you see that there is a link there for you to watch Charles de Gaulle's speech in Montreal. So I want you to take a look and see that. I was able to live through that and see it in the nightly news. I want you to see what effect it had on the crowds. And we find that as soon as that speech was over, the federal government contacted the folks in Montreal, and they hurried Charles de Gaulle to the airport and flew him home to Paris, not to encourage any more separatist sentiment in Quebec. Well, the rise of the separatist movement in the province, we find that independence from Canada is the only sure way to save French culture from extinction in the mind of many French speakers. The happiest moment for the separatists in Quebec was in 1976. In 1976, we have the election of Renee Levesque. Renee Levesque, and we have the first PQ party that's formed in Quebec, the Parti Québécois. We find that Renee Levesque is very similar to Jesse Thurmond from North Carolina. You find that he was a newsman, a TV newsman, and he translated his celebrity, being a TV newsman, into becoming a very successful politician. So Renee Levesque becomes the first successful leader of the PQ to form a government in 1976. Renee Levesque is terribly charismatic, like, if you will, like Ronald Reagan had been. He expressed this separatist ideal in clear and forthright manner, and we find that certainly he helped build the momentum that the PQ party had generated from the late 1960s and all the way through the 1970s. We find that this momentum disappears in 1980. In 1980, there is a referendum on sovereignty association with Canada, and we find that 60% of all Quebecers voted no when asked if they wanted the provincial government of Quebec to negotiate separation from Canada. So we find in 1980 that first vote is no, and 60% of the Quebecers vote no. They began to examine things such as, well, what will happen to my Social Security? Will an independent Quebec still pay my Social Security? What will happen to Quebec's share of the national debt? What will happen to Quebec's membership in the United Nations or in NATO? So once many of the Quebecers began to, the Québécois began to think of those issues, many stepped back from the prospect of independence. But there was a second referendum. The second referendum was held on October 30th, 1995. And on this time, we have the PQ being led by Jacques Parizeau. Jacques Parizeau and the BQ, the Bloc Québécois, in Ottawa, the BQ was led by Lucien Bouchard. And Parizeau and Bouchard led a vigorous campaign to, again, separate Quebec from Canada. And at this point, the margin was much, much closer. This time, the Separatists lost by only 2%. The election was razor thin, and Separatism was defeated by only 2%. Although at the time it appeared that the Separatists were going to prevail and they were going to win. Well, in the 1960s and the 1970s, those who were impatient with peaceful attempts to separate, they turned to violence. And here's what I had talked about in an earlier discussion, I think during our political party discussion. We find that terrorists began to place bombs in mailboxes, particularly in suburban Westmont. This is an affluent English-speaking neighborhood in Montreal. And you find that in all there were over 150 bombs that went off in mailboxes in residential areas, not only in Montreal but also in suburban Ottawa and in Quebec City. This all comes to a culmination in 1970 in the FLQ crisis, the Front for the Liberation of Quebec. You have the kidnapping of two men. The one man was a British trade emissary who was based in Canada, and the other was a Quebec province official. So these two individuals, James Cross was the English trade official who lived in Montreal, and Pierre Laporte was the Quebec cabinet minister in the Bourassa government. And the Quebec cabinet minister, Pierre Laporte, is murdered by the FLQ. And his body is found in the trunk of a car on the outskirts of Montreal. And in reaction to this, Pierre Elliott Trudeau declares martial law. He also takes away the right for people to know, the writ of habeas corpus, so the right of people to know why they're being arrested, why they're being held, and for be held just a short period of time. The last time that the writ of habeas corpus was suspended in the United States was during the Civil War. Well, the October crisis of 1970, there's a link that I want you to look at on your PowerPoints, and it will summarize. There are CBC reporters that summarize this this period of time and show you some of the events that were taking place at that time. Well, as I said, in response to these kidnappings, the Trudeau government declares martial law. They declare the War Measures Act. And you find, if you look at all the links on the PowerPoint, the famous remarks of Pierre Trudeau. When Pierre Trudeau was going into the Parliament building in Ottawa, there's one CBC newsman that grabbed him and put a microphone in his face and said, what lengths will you go to, Prime Minister? Where will you go? What will you do to deal with these separatists? Are you going to put machine guns on every corner? How much will you do to end the separatism? And Quebec, and I'm sorry, Trudeau simply smiles and he says, watch me, and he goes into the Parliament. And in fact, the War Measures Act did quell the separatist movement very quickly, and Trudeau worked with all sides, as did his government and as did the opposition, to bring this unrest to a conclusion. But the War Measures Act did what? The War Measures Act allowed police and the military were given extraordinary powers to find and arrest kidnappers and their accomplices. The warrants were not needed to enter and search homes. The mail could be opened and phone lines could be tapped. And armed soldiers were placed on the streets in Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec City. So the combination of the War Measures Act and the murder of Pierre Laporte made English Canadians pay attention to Quebec as they never have before. The terrorists were caught, but concerns about Quebec separatism have never been abated. In fact, what happened to the terrorists eventually is they negotiate a release. They negotiate their release to Fidel Castro, and there's a plane waiting for them at the Montreal airport. They are put on the plane and they are sent directly into the arms of Fidel Castro, where they stayed for the rest of their lives. I have no idea what kind of life that they had in Cuba, but I doubt that the Cubans were speaking very much French with them. Well, what was Pierre Elliott Trudeau's reaction to Quebec separatism? Pierre Elliott Trudeau told the French to stay in Canada and to increase their power in Ottawa. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was always a federalist, not a separatist. So Trudeau was always a federalist, not a separatist. And again, he told the French to stay in Canada and to increase their power in Ottawa. Trudeau felt that Renee Levesque's plan would destroy the French-Canadian culture, and his statement was, Trudeau always said, quote, "Be masters in your own house, but make that home all of Canada. Be masters in your own home, be masters in your own house, but make that home all of Canada." And that symbolized his view that federalism, or a strong united Canada, was essential for French Canada. On the next PowerPoint that you find, you'll see Trudeau's reaction to the FLQ crisis, where he's saying, "Just watch me." And that turns out to be one of the titles of one of his biographies, and that's done in recent years. Trudeau's rise to the leadership of the Liberal Party and his election as Prime Minister in 1968 actually brought a sigh of relief in English Canada because they believed that Trudeau brought political sanity back to Quebec. And these feelings seemed to be justified as the FLQ crisis in 1970 was quelled and was solved by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. 1968 also sent other strong Quebec Federalists to Ottawa, and soon many French Canadians held an array of important posts in the Canadian government. His government passed the Official Languages Act in 1969. The Official Languages Act in 1969 made Canada officially a bilingual community. And this boosts the Federalist cause, if you will. Throughout the 1980s and the early 1990s, the role of Quebec in the Canadian Confederation centered around constitutional reform. And until 1982, because of Canada's constitution, was an act of what? The British Parliament. Until 1982, because Canada's constitution is an act of the British Parliament, all amendments or changes to the Canadian Constitution had to have the consent of the British Parliament. So we have all federal provincial conferences to decide on a formal way of amending the British North American Act without obtaining British consent. All of them had failed. All of them had failed. Trudeau made a final attempt in 1982 to get provincial support for an amending formula. But we find that if the federal government couldn't get support from all the provinces, Trudeau decided that the federal government was going to proceed on its own and ask Britain to agree to the federal proposals. And on November 4th, 1981, finally a compromise is reached. All the provinces, except Quebec, agreed to an amending formula and to the entrenchment of a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A Charter of Rights and Freedoms is in the Canadian Constitution now. The British government agreed in March of 1982, and the British North American Act was patriated, was sent back to Canada. The repatriation of the British North American Act without Quebec's consent, however, was not well received in Quebec. Now let's take a break here. Okay, we're back from videos from the Ville to continue our look at Quebec separatism. We left off at about September of 1984. In September of 1984, we find a new era of constitutional reform that is directed towards Quebec separatism. And here we find the Progressive Conservatives win the federal election under Brian Mulroney. We find that Mulroney promised to persuade Quebec to accept the 1982 constitutional changes that had been made by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And we find that Mulroney worked tirelessly to address the concerns of the Quebec separatists during his time in office. And this led to the establishment of two accords. We have first the Meech Lake Accord, and secondly the Charlottetown Accord, were reached by his administration to answer all the concerns of Quebec. And both met unfortunate, if you will, endings. We find that the Meech Lake Accord was signed in May of 1987, and it was signed by all 10 provincial premiers. It granted distinct and special status to Quebec, and that's what Quebec always had sought, special status. But it required provincial unanimity for any further constitutional change. So every province, regardless of its size, regardless of its population, could veto any future changes, even if 9 other provinces agreed. We needed unanimity. Well, after signing the accord, the premiers had to obtain the approval of their provincial legislatures. And then approval by the provincial legislatures had to be completed by June of 1990. Well, this didn't happen. Newfoundland and Manitoba didn't make the deadline. And as a result, the accord died. The Meech Lake Accord died when Newfoundland and Manitoba couldn't make that deadline. And therefore, Quebec continued to remain outside of the Constitution. In addition to treating Quebec as a distinct society and giving each province a veto over future constitutional changes, the Meech Lake Accord strengthened the provinces. The British North American Act had made Ottawa stronger than the provinces. The Meech Lake Accord gave the provinces power to appoint their senators and their Supreme Court judges, and to take charge of immigration into their own province, and to opt out of any national social programs. Amazing amount of power for each and every province. A huge devolution of power from the national level to the provincial level. It was this weakening of the federal government, as much of the granting of the special status to Quebec, that drove the opposition to Meech Lake. Quebec's treatment of its English-speaking population, its minority, didn't help get any support, if you will, for the Meech Lake Accord. You find that in December of 1988, you find the Canadian Supreme Court ruled Quebec's Bill 101 illegal. Quebec had established rules and regulations. We find that Act 101 ruled that all outside store signs were to be in French only. And the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guaranteed all Canadians, quote, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression, and other media of communication, was violated by Act 101. And of course, Act 101 had brought lots of discord among the English speakers in the province of Quebec. Premier Bourassa introduced then Bill 178. Premier Bourassa, Quebec, the PQ, introduced Bill 178 to show French residents efforts to protect their language. Bill 178 would say that all outside signs must be in French, but signs indoors could be bilingual. Well, the Quebec National Assembly passed Bill 178 by using the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that allows provincial legislation to take precedence over some provisions of the Charter. Well, this leads eventually to, we find the Mulroney administration and turns to the Charlottetown Accord. The Charlottetown Accord is reached in 1992. And you find that with Meech Lake as a minimum, federal, provincial, and native leaders worked out a more comprehensive agreement. The Charlottetown Accord stated that Quebec, quote, constitutes within Canada a distinct society which includes a French-speaking majority, a unique culture, and a civil law tradition, unquote. That's pretty heady language, isn't it? It stated that Quebec, quote, constitutes within Canada a distinct society which includes a French-speaking majority, a unique culture, and a civil law tradition, end of quote. All the political parties except the Reform Party supported this measure, but there was a national referendum that put it to the test in October 26, 1992. In October 26, 1992, the national referendum was defeated. So the precise relationship between Quebec and Canada remains in flux to this very day. The 1992 vote ended up being followed by the Quebec independence referendum of 1995. And the Quebec independence referendum of 1995 was held on October 30th, 1995, where 94% of the eligible voters participated, and the referendum lost only by 2%. Former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was less bold in his opposition to Quebec's sovereignty. You find that this liberal Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, what he wanted to do was simply talk all Quebec separatist movement or all Quebec separatist efforts. He just wanted to talk them to death. So, like Trudeau and like Mulroney, Jean Chrétien was from Quebec, but he wanted to let time pass. And as time would pass, he thought the support for Quebec separatism would dissipate. He wanted to, quote, wait it out, unquote. And that's exactly what he did. He simply never addressed the concerns of the Quebec separatists. He said, we'll get to it, we'll get to it, we'll get to it, and he never did. Well, in the Harper years, when the Conservatives returned to power under Stephen Harper, you find that polls continued to show diminishing levels of support for Quebec separatism. On May 2010, the Montreal Gazette believed that 58% of all Quebecois believed that the issue was settled and that Quebec was firmly in the Dominion and things were set. The Toronto Sun did its own poll in April of 2010, and they thought that their poll shows that only 39.9%, essentially 40% of the Quebecois wanted sovereignty. So those were the levels of support that were seen at that time, and apparently it's continued to slowly but steadily diminish. Well, in April of 2014, under Stephen Harper and under the Conservative government, the PQ government of Pauline Maurice. So here in 2014, Quebec is controlled at the provincial level by the PQ. And the provincial leader, her name is the Premier of Quebec, was Pauline Maurice. And Pauline Maurice called for early elections to the National Assembly in Quebec because she thought that she could increase the number of seats that the PQ would have, and it would reignite the movement towards Quebec separatism. But Pauline and the rest of Canada was quite surprised. The PQ lost the election, and became the opposition party. The Liberal Party won the election at the provincial level. And we find in the 125-seat National Assembly, the Liberals won 70 seats, and the PQ won only 30 seats. Minor parties won 25 seats. This was a clear message from Quebec voters that economic stability was more important than concerns about separatism. In fact, the PQ leader, Pauline Maurice, even lost her own seat within the National Assembly. And that's the current state of Quebec separatism at the present time. If you have any questions about this issue, let me know. I urge you to look at the links that are embedded in the PowerPoints. They're very useful, and they'll provide you with background information and video footage that is live from that period of time. That would be very useful for you to take a look at. Okay, we'll be back with another subject in a little bit.